Hello and welcome back to Pictorial on Relay FM. I'm Quinn Rose and I didn't go to art school, but I still love to learn about art and have opinions about it.
And I'm Betty. I also didn't go to art school, but I also love to learn about art and sometimes read news about art and laugh about them.
I think that news from the art world rarely makes mainstream news. I think the last time was probably the Banksy painting that got halfway shredded, which we're not going to do another full episode about Banksy. We did talk about Banksy, and that painting did recently get resold, like the half shredded one, for like 3 times as much.
Yeah.
Just saying we called it. But anyway, so not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the latest piece of art news that has hit the internet, which went a little bit viral a couple months ago after an artist, I'm just going to describe this as like the broad strokes, which is the first thing that I heard about it, was all the headlines were like, an artist gets commissioned to do a work of art for a museum. Instead, he pockets the money and submits blank canvases titled "Take the Money and Run."
Yeah, I heard about this too. Like, actually, a friend of mine sent me this article and was just like, you know, have you heard about this? Because it sounds ridiculous and quite an interesting thing to read about.
We're basically today going to go through what happened here. And then I think we're just going to talk about it because it's such a fascinating subject. And I think we're just going to share thoughts and opinions. There are a couple of key things here that are important context. So first of all, this artist, his name is Jens Haaning. This happened in Denmark. So he's a Danish artist. He's very well known, especially in Denmark. He's very well known for doing like pretty out of the box, provocative modern art. Like he is not a traditional artist by any means. And he's like a little rapscallion artist, out there. That's his reputation. And the other major player in this is the Kunsten Museum of Modern Art in Denmark. So they have this exhibit that is it's up right now. So if you're in Denmark, check it out. The exhibition is called Work It Out. And this is all about work and the future of work. Some questions that I'm quoting from their website right now that the artists in this exhibit are tackling are: what is work and why do we work? Are there limits to our working lives? Can we in the future create a more sustainable working life for the individual and society? And how can art and the art museum create the framework for new thinking about the working life of the future? So they're making this exhibit. They hit him up and they're like, hey, Haaning, 10 years ago, you made these works. It was called An Average Danish Annual Income and An Average Austrian Annual Income. They were first exhibited in 2007 and in 2010, and they use actual cash that shows the average income of the two countries, part of which translated into U.S. dollars. Sorry, Betty. Translated into U.S. dollars. The Danish income was about $37,800. The average Austrian income is about $29,000. And it's it's an actual bills, and it's this physical statement and physical display of average annual income, which obviously you can see why they would be interested for this works exhibition. So they're like, hey, can you do this? And he was like, yeah, no problem. And then 2 days before the exhibition opens, he emails them and he's like, actually, no. And he mails them back. So these blank canvas containers were supposed to be full of the money and they were just empty. And he's like, this is called Take the Money and Run. And I'm going to just say this. I'm almost in the background and then I want to hear your initial thoughts. But my favorite thing about this is the museum director, Anderson, said that when he actually saw Take the Money and Run in person for the first time, he laughed out loud. So what are your initial thoughts to this background?
Yeah, when I initially heard about this, like whenever I hear about news, like these like shocking news in the art world, like my first instinct is to not have like an initial judgment about it, because I'm like, there must be more, and there usually is. So like I was initially just kind of confused, because I had thought that it was like he was supposed to be like paid this money for his artwork, but then I realized that, oh no, it's actually the money itself is the artwork. And yeah, like I thought it was really funny, but I would say that like obviously this artist is well known in Denmark, but I've never heard of him, and most likely nobody else outside of Denmark has ever heard of him until now. And so I think similar to some of the stuff we talked about before, like that one time we talked about these people burning a Banksy artwork for like to draw attention to NFTs, like immediately I'm just like, well, this is probably some sort of publicity stunt type of thing, which it kind of is. Like I'm skeptical about it, but I'm like, this person is an artist, like, you know, he obviously wants to send some sort of message about it, and it can't, or it probably isn't just him committing fraud, but in a way it is. So
wait, okay, you hit on so many important things there that I want to talk about. First of all, but I do think we cannot highlight this enough, where I think the very common perception, and this was my perception when I first heard about the story, is that like, oh, he was paid money to create an artwork, and instead he sent back like this conceptual blank art. And when I first heard that, and I was like, that's so funny, and also like kind of fair enough, but that's not what happened. They lent him $84,000 and he is contractually obligated to give it back. I guess I'll get into this now. This is $84,000 that they handed over to this guy. Well, I mean, they put it in his bank account, and there is a contract that says at the end of this exhibit in January, like, you give us the money back, because the money's supposed to be in the museum. And the museum directors are basically like, they're taking this like pretty well, but they're like, if it's still our money and we do still expect him to give it back, and we're hoping that he will and it'll be fine, but if he doesn't, you know, we might have to sue him a little bit. Like, there is kind of this energy where they're like, oh my God, please, please give it back.
Right now, they're just probably hoping that when the time comes when January rolls around, because I guess technically right now he hasn't totally like broke his contract. Like, he says he intends to, which they're like, that's not okay, but he technically still has until January to change his mind. And it's possible when that date comes around and the exhibit closes, he might just be like, never mind, here's your money back, because he doesn't want to get sued. But like right now he seems to say he has no intention of doing that.
Okay, at this point I want to turn to like what, like, as you were talking about, like, oh, is this just a publicity stunt? And like, what is he actually like saying with this? Because first of all, basically a lot of people have accused the museum of like, hey, is this a publicity stunt? Were you in on it? And everyone at the museum is like, we swear to God, we did not know about this. Like, he did this to us, which I believe. I totally believe. There is a part of this where like almost no one who isn't like very involved in the contemporary art world would have heard of Jens Haaning before, who's not in Denmark, and no one would have heard of the Kunsten Museum of Modern Art either. You know, like, it's not a world-renowned museum. It seems very nice. Like, I'm not trying to diss this museum. I'm just saying, like, this is not like it's not like the Louvre, you know.
Right. Yeah.
On one hand, he may have pulled in like a ton of monetary value in terms of pure publicity for this museum. There's an entire FAQ page just about this one piece on their website now, because it's so like, I mean, obviously so many people are looking it up, and they're like, hey, have you seen increased traffic from this? And they're like, it's kind of too hard soon to tell, like, you know, our exhibits are popular when they open, like, who can say? But I'm saying, like, if even a tiny percentage of people who heard about the story like looked up the museum at all, and if even like however many percentage of people who heard about the story like are actually in Denmark or nearby and like decided to check it out for that reason. Like, if I was in Denmark, I would 100% go. I mean, I feel like
for sure
that has to be something. But oh my God, okay. I'm like having a ball about this, if you can't tell. All of that was was an aside to what I'm trying to get at, which was his actual sort of artist statement to this, which I think is interesting. And I wanted to do a little bit of a reading series. So I've sent you a quote from his press release that he made, obviously translated into English. And I was wondering if you could just read his this quote from his press release for us.
Everyone would like to have more money, and in our society, work industries are valued differently. The artwork is essentially about the working conditions of artists. It is a statement saying that we also have the responsibility of questioning the structures that we are a part of. And if these structures are completely unreasonable, we must break with them. It can be your marriage, your work, it can be any type of societal structure. End quote.
I think this is such an interesting and smart tack to take, especially if you'll remember the questions I read earlier that they say this exhibit is all about, which is one of those was, how can the art museum create the framework for new thinking about the working life of the future? And he literally just started playing Rihanna's "Bitch Better Have My Money" and walked out. Like, so what do you think about his statement here? What is your opinion?
Learning about what this artwork is a part of, like what the actual the show's message or theme, what it's trying to explore, make a lot more sense. And I definitely agree that like I'll get into it. Like there's still parts of it that kind of like bothers me right now, but I will say I do agree that it is smart in terms of like getting attention to, you know, like what he's trying to draw attention to, which is like, again, working conditions of artists, and this show is about working conditions in general. So yeah, so I think it definitely makes a lot more sense knowing what this show is about. Like what you were mentioning earlier is like a lot of these news that we hear about in the art world is about things that are super expensive, or works that are sold for millions of dollars, or artists who are paid like exorbitant amount of money because they're so famous. But it does seem like Haaning, as well as probably a lot of artists who display their works in the Kunsten Museum, as well as in most places, like don't make a lot of money. Like that's, and I think we've talked about this before, but it's like what makes the news are obviously these few people who have ungodly amount of money. But the reality is most artists are like their work isn't valued in a way that's, reasonable, or at least that's the argument Haaning seems to be making. I do like the fact that he's drawing attention to this, because I think it's something that not a lot of people really talk about. Like we're always talking about the pieces that are sold for millions of dollars.
Yeah. And even within this piece, a really cool fact about this is we have a lot of exact monetary amounts, which also, this is the part where there's some discrepancies in his story and the museum story, which is quite interesting. But basically, so he claimed that it was going to cost him about $3,000 out of pocket to recreate this art, due to things about like different amounts of money used and just like other expenses. And he claims that was sort of the initial inspiration for taking this choice instead of saying like, this is unfair treatment and exploitative, and why should I be paying out of pocket for this? And so I'm going to make this artistic statement about the relationships between artists and museums instead. However, the museum director, Anderson, claims that the contract that he is under was provided up to almost $7,000 for work expenses. So that amount of money that he said he would have been out of pocket should have been covered by this contract, according to the museum. Even further, though, so this museum, they're not acquiring this piece that he's making and recreating. This museum primarily works on terms of just a viewing basis, rotating exhibits. And so they're not paying him to buy his work. He was going to receive a fee of 10,000 kroner, which is only like $1,300, which, I mean, not to say, I mean, if you want to give me $1,200, like I'll take it. But I'm saying like that's not a ton for, artwork. And plus, there is a viewing fee that is allegedly determined by the Danish government. There was no specific information in these articles about what that amount was, but we can assume it's probably not a ton. So a couple different numbers flying around here, like, oh, he claims it would have cost him money to make this museum, saying that's not true. But regardless, he wasn't getting paid a ton to make it. And there's a whole conversation out there about like, oh, well, if he was just putting money in a frame, like how much money can you pay someone to do that anyway? But like that's
Right.
that's a conversation. That's a whole separate conversation. We're operating under the assumption of like, okay, like he's an artist and this is his craft and he should be paid for his labor. So like, what is the amount that he should be paid for his labor according to sort of like these different sides? And it's also fair to say, you know, he signed this contract, right? Like he is very much under contract. So shouldn't he have just not signed the contract if he wasn't happy with the amount of money he was getting paid? But I mean, people do things all the time that exploit their labor because the world sucks. But anyway, I feel like that there is a lot of sort of twists and turns to the monetary aspect of this.
Yeah, for sure. I do agree. Like $1,200-$1,300 again, better than zero. Like it's probably better than not having work. So presumably he took it because he's like, well, it's something, but it really isn't a lot of money. And like even really just to like, again, I don't know how much time and effort it is to put money in a canvas, but yeah, it doesn't seem like it's a lot of money if somebody wants to make a living from doing this. I did read that, you know, the Work It Out exhibition, I guess it's trying to explore, like working conditions of common people. Like, you know, this work is supposed to highlight the average like wage of Austrians and Danish people. And then it's also supposed to explore like other aspects of working life and ways to make it sustainable for individuals and things like that. So it makes sense to question how artists are compensated in society. Is that fair? You know, along with like, you know, other questions that it asks about other professions. I think it is important as a part of this show to point out stuff like this. But I do think like one thing that I was mentioning earlier that bothers me like is the fact that, again, since this museum, like you mentioned, is not the Louvre, like I presume it's not like the museum has a lot of money. And as somebody who has worked at a museum, really the museum itself is not rich. And also, quite often they're publicly funded, so the money is like technically taxpayers' dollars, or at least partially comes from that. So it really just seems like, even though it, you know, he is pointing out like these like unfairness about artists, like artists and how they're compensated, it seems like it's not fair to blame it on museums, who are also kind of on the losing end quite often as well.
That's a really interesting part of this because, yeah, the museum has said, well, not the building, the people who work at the museum have said,
Right.
we don't have a ton of money. They said that this money specifically that they lent him came from, and I quote, a modest fund earmarked for building upkeep. I think there's two different questions here because I think there's the question of, is this a good piece of art? And then there's a question of, is this an ethical piece of art? And I think that the second question is this interesting linchpin of like, who is the greater victim here? Is it the artist or the museum? Not necessarily, like, things can be simultaneously true. I think that there are tons and tons of organizations that have very little money that are extremely exploitative. You hear this all the time. Nonprofits, museums, anything to do with entertainment, at culture, basically anything that is not extremely lucrative, that's like outside of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. You know, like there are all these places, but also like so often extremely exploitative from the people who work there and work with them, because those are the kinds of places that people work with and work for because they were very passionate about it. And this is all getting to a point of like, oh, boo-hoo, like this guy, you know, like he's a pretty successful artist in Denmark, apparently. Like he talks about having miserable working conditions. And it's like, some people work on farms, Haaning.
Yeah. Right.
Like that has to be said and acknowledged. But also, you know, he doesn't work on a farm. He's an artist, and so he's speaking through the medium that he has. And so all of this to say is like, no, I don't think that it's quote unquote like ethical to steal from a not very well funded place. But that doesn't mean that the place is ethical either, and it doesn't make the statement that he's making invalid.
You know what? That's a great point. And again, like I do, you know, knowing people who work in the museum and art gallery industry, it's true. Like it's not just the artists themselves who aren't paid very well. Like a lot of people I know who are museum staff, even curators, like people who do, like, in my opinion, very important work, maybe not to other people, but they're quite often, yeah, they're not compensated well. Like a lot of people like work these like contracts with like no benefits and are not in the greatest like working condition. Again, it's not like sweatshops in a third world country. It's like miserable, but yeah, it's not great. And yeah, I've definitely heard about like, you know, people who do believe that like a lot of these, you know, museums or these organizations that aren't very well funded do try to take advantage of people, and that is definitely the case. And I think in a sense, like at least to me, he's not just pointing out how like he thinks like artists aren't being appreciated for their work. It's kind of like it's a wider industry problem. But then I guess the other thing that it makes me think about is like going back to your question of like, you know, is this a good work of art? And I'm doing like air quotes with my hands right now, so which people can't see, but it is good. I feel like if this particular work gets people to think about this question that he is invoking. But the problem is, I feel like the general public of people who hear about this news is just going to see this as another like, oh, this is just some artist doing a dumb stunt, or like, you know, trying to be funny, or like I feel like people are going to categorize this as another example of like some contemporary like artwork that they don't think is even real art. So, and it now also involves an artist who is doing something unethical. So it's like, I feel like it doesn't paint artists in a good name and could actually have the negative effect of being more detrimental. Like people might value artists even less now because of this.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of people very much view this as like champagne problems kind of thing, because I also think that there's a very popular conception, and it's completely understandable why, but the very popular perception of like anyone who's in a museum is rich, and like anyone who's in a museum is very successful, and like being like the association with art museums is like automatically very high status, which is not necessarily true at all. Like you can be in an art museum and still be very poor. You can have 1 million followers on Twitter and still be very poor. Like, I think that the human brain, like, it's extremely easy to connect visibility with success and financial success, especially when I would say a good lot of the time that correlation is actually much weaker than we would assume it is. I want to share my last kind of direct quotes that I have from him here, which are statements that he made on Danish radio, again, translated into English. And first of all, I laughed out loud when I read this. He says, "The work is I have taken their money." First of all, I want that on a t-shirt. The work is that I have taken their money is so goddamn funny.
It is.
He goes on to say, "It's not theft. It is a breach of contract, and breach of contract is part of the work," which is the funniest distinction I've ever heard.
That's great.
He's a conscientious objector to this contract that he signed. Like, what?
Oh my.
Okay, but I do want to read the more serious quote, and then we can discuss all of the above. But and I alluded to this a second ago, but he also says, I encourage other people who have working conditions as miserable as mine to do the same. If they're sitting in some job and not getting paid and are actually being asked to pay money to go to work, again, going back to some discrepancies there, but then grab what you can and beat it, is what he says. And I think we absolutely have to mention the fact that we are in a huge labor upheaval. I know in the United States, this is definitely happening. I assume it's very similar in Canada. And there are a lot of extremely real and extremely tragic reasons why there is a massive labor shortage right now. But one effect of this has been, in addition to just people being fed up, is an absolute tidal wave of people quitting their jobs, quitting their jobs in sometimes quite satisfying and dramatic ways that are shared on social media. And it's not because working sucks. I mean, everyone knows working sucks. That's why you get paid to be there. But because labor practices in a lot of places, I don't know if I could say most places. I haven't counted personally, but it feels like most places, especially in low wage positions, hourly positions, labor practices are so wildly exploitative and bosses are so cruel. And it's just simply not worth the money anymore to people. And so I think that this piece, again, like this is coming from like a guy who is like an artist in Denmark, and we don't know his life situation and his personal financial situation or anything like that. I think that the message that he is trying to send is very much in line with the kind of temperature of the labor force out there right now.
I think I did read briefly that in this Work It Out exhibition, they have some other works. There is one where I can't find the name of the artist right now, but it examines the working conditions of nurses. And then another artist, Josh Klein, he has a work that is a FedEx parcel that has reproductions of severed arms of delivery men, which is, I guess, a way to talk about, maybe he's trying to say that working for FedEx is like having your arms cut off, or I don't know, but yeah, like what you're saying is absolutely a thing that's happening right now. Like, I'm sure it's happening everywhere. Like, I've heard so many instances, like just here in Canada, of nurses just quitting. There's a huge shortage of nurses, like everywhere. Again, in a time where healthcare work is so like critical. And this, like I said, like I was saying before, yeah, this, I think it doesn't just call attention, or at least it seems like he's not just calling attention to like, artists who are not getting paid well. Like, he is saying he wants to like question these structures in general. The one thing that I do think I personally want to emphasize, like, to people who hear about this news and just think it's a ridiculous like art stunt, which it kind of is, but but I think he is right that like the role of like art museums isn't just to like display pretty pictures. Like it's about talking about like important questions in society and having a conversation about these important issues. So is an art work that's just conceptual and an idea art? Like, to me, it definitely can be. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be something physical. It can just, like he said, the artwork is not the physical blank canvas. It is the action he took to breach the contract, which there is precedent for. Like, there's lots of artworks that's not like the physical piece, that is actually like a performance or whatever action that people took. And usually these types of works are to like question or talk about something, talk about an important issue in society. So I do think that's okay. But again, going back to what we were mentioning before, it's just, it takes away from his message when he is literally doing something unethical. Like, I think it covers up or it distracts from the message that he's trying to send.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting little thought puzzle that he's created over like, is he the bad guy or not? And I think that a lot of that is going to come down to, does he give the money back? And it's such a weird, tricky thing because it's like, oh, if he gives the money back, then he's kind of, you know, taking the wind out of his own sails there, right? Because it kind of wrecks the own statement he was making. But if he doesn't give the money back, then he has officially stolen $84,000, which is it's a lot of money. I honestly don't know who I'm rooting for in this story. I think that I completely agree with his message. I love that this has reached so far because I think that's great for him and the museum. This has gotten so much publicity and like nobody loses there. I totally get your point about like reinforcing negative ideas of like artists and modern artists, but I also don't believe in respectability politics. So like, I'm like, whatever. If people have bad opinions because they haven't researched it, like that's not his fault. So that's my personal opinion. I just don't care about that stuff. I guess my final concluding thought on this is just like, I just think it's so interesting. And I honestly am like really glad it happened because I think it creates such an interesting conversation for people to have, which is like what art is trying to do. And that's awesome. I think he did a really good art piece in that way. And I mostly am just going to be really interested to see what happens to this money. Like, has this man spent this money? Like, is he going to like distribute it to charity in a really sort of publicity stunt kind of way? Is he going to spend it in a publicity stunt kind of way? Like, is the statement going to continue? Is he going to give it back? Like, I feel like we're going to have to check in later.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a follow-up like after January to see what has happened. But yeah, like you mentioned earlier, like this museum and presumably him has gotten a lot more attention because of this. And now attention doesn't always mean money, but hey, like maybe maybe as a result of this, the museum can make $84,000 more than they did the year before, and maybe be cool with it. I don't know.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty big jump, but like, hey, maybe it's appreciation over time. You get that name recognition, you get those feet in the door. You never know. All right. Well, that is going to do it for us for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. You can find our show notes at relay.fm/pictorial, or you can follow us on Twitter or Instagram at pictorialpod. And you can also follow me on Instagram at aspiringrobotfm.
And you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at articulationsv, and I am also on YouTube as Articulations. And speaking of YouTube, we have a YouTube channel, Pictorial Podcast, where we upload video versions of our podcasts, usually a few weeks after the audio has gone out. For this particular episode, you'll probably just be seeing a blank canvas. So not as exciting as usual, but, you know, you'll see something.
It's just a blank video as a statement.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, art enthusiasts.